Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another daily dose of Dominaria spoilers, and we're kind of getting near the end of Dominaria spoiler season. I think we're done with the mythics, but we have some sweet rares, a ton of lower rarity stuff to talk about today, and a card that I missed yesterday that came out over the weekend that is actually super sweet. So let's jump right into it, starting with one of my favorite cards from the entire Dominaria set, Jasu Ves Lich Knight, and this card is pretty awesome. So for 4 mana you get a 4/5, which is already pretty sweet. It is legendary, but whatever. Zombie Knight, so a couple of potentially relevant creature types. It also has a huge kicker cost of 6, so you can cast it for 4 mana, get a 4/5 with Menace, or you cast it for 10 mana. If you cast it for 10 mana, it comes along with 8 2/2 black Zombie Knight creature tokens with Menace. That's right, if you cast it with the kicker cost, you get 20 power and toughness for 10 mana. So the sweet thing about Jasu Ves is it's good on both sides. If you cast it unkicked, you're getting Siege Rhino stats with Menace, which is already just like a good creature. 4/5s for 4 are already reasonable. A very good creature on its own. And then in the late game, if the game goes really long, you have like Army of the Damned, essentially, where you're just getting a huge lethal board. Menace, make sure you can get in as much damage as possible. So at 10 mana it ends a game, and at 4 mana it's still a reasonable creature. So worth pointing out, in Standard we got Cabal Stronghold to make a bunch of mana. Also in Modern, if we're playing like Mono Black Devotion, we can use Nykthos to make tons of mana. I don't know if either of those ways are really going to be legitimate. We'll have to wait and see. But regardless, Jasu Ves is super sweet because its front half blocks everything. So that's kind of the judge of this card. If the front half of a kicker card is good, it's probably good. And Jasu Ves is already good as a 4/5 for 5. If you think about all the threats in Standard, sure, some things have flying, sure, there's Hazoret and the Scarab God, but for the most part, Jasu Ves just locks down the board. J-Light Ranger, no matter how much you explore, gonna get eaten by Jasu Ves. Champion of Wits, even coming back from the graveyard, along with any of the Eternalized cards, Scarab God tokens, going to get eaten by Jasu Ves. Deathgord Scavenger, even if it eats something to grow, gonna get blocked by Jasu Ves. So you get a really good creature on the front half, you get a game-ending threat on the back half, you get relevant creature types. I just love this card. I think it'll see play in Commander, I think it'll see play in Standard. The only challenge is figuring out how to make enough mana to cast it, but maybe that doesn't even matter. Like a 4/5 Menace for 4 is already good enough that even if you only kick it once every several games and it closes out a really long grindy control game, you're still getting a pretty good deal with Jasu Ves as like a 1 of or a 2 of. So I'm really excited for this one. I think this card is pretty good and I expect it to see play somewhere. Next up, we have the Antiquities War, which is a pretty cool saga, our blue rare saga. So first and second lore counter let you dig 5 deep in your library to grab an artifact from those cards, rest go on the bottom, and then on the third lore counter, so the second turn after you cast it, all of your artifacts become 5/5 artifact creatures until end of turn. So this is basically like Tezzeret Agent of Bolas. Like, it's restricted, it's not as good because you don't have as much control over it, but you basically get to +1 your Tezzeret Agent of Bolas twice, and then you hopefully just win the game by attacking with a ton of artifacts. So we'll have to see what happens in Standard. There are some really powerful non-creature artifacts that would be nice to turn into creatures, and also of note, it turns all your artifacts into artifact creatures, which means you turn your Ornithopter into a 5/5 flyer or something like that. So there's definitely potential in the right build to just win the game with Antiquities War. We've seen a lot of stuff that suggests maybe Metalwork Colossus can make a comeback before rotation. We got the vehicles that are good from Kaladesh block, we got stuff like the Immortal Sun now, and now we have Antiquities War to just dig through our deck, give us another way of closing out the game. So I actually think this card is super sweet. It takes some building around. You gotta be artifact heavy to make it worthwhile, but in the right artifact heavy deck, it has potential to be really good. Could also be the backup finisher in a Paradox Engine Aetherflux Reservoir combo deck. If you're not gonna be able to combo off and win for whatever reason, you can just play this and turn all of your Aetherflux Reservoirs and Paradox Engines and Mana Rocks into creatures to win the game. So I am super excited to brew around the Antiquities War. I feel like there's a shot with a little bit of careful deck building that you could build a pretty legit, at least like budget deck, and maybe even more than that in Standard with this card to power it up. Next on our list, we got Torgar, Famine Incarnate. And this card is really big and can come down super quickly. So 8 mana, you get a 7/6. When it enters the battlefield, up to one target player's life total becomes half of their starting life total rounded down. So basically, if you're playing Standard, a 20 life format, you get to set someone's life total to 10. So if you're at 2 life when this comes down, you can gain a bunch of life. If your opponent's at 20 life or 100 life, you get to reset their life down to 10. In Commander, it works a little different. That's 20 instead of 10, but still, potentially a lot of damage. The big deal about this card, though, is it has kind of this weird alternate casting cost. As an additional cost to cast it, you can sacrifice any number of creature spells, and Torgar costs 2 less to cast for each creature sacrificed this way. So what this means is, in theory, if you go Legion's Landing on turn 1, Servo Exhibition on turn 2, on turn 3, you sack, pay 2 black mana, get down a Torgar, set your opponent to 10, and you have a 7/6 left over, which is potentially really powerful. And even more competitive, potentially, is just like a recursive creature deck, like a mono black deck. Dreadwanderer coming back from the graveyard, Scrappy Scrounger coming back from the graveyard. You don't have to all-in focus on turn 3, but by turn 4, you have this huge 7/6 that doesn't get Fatal Push and dodges some removal, set your opponent down to a low life total, and then get back your Scrap Heaps, get back your Dreadwanderers, win the game. So this card feels really powerful to me, and that doesn't even include the ultra jank kill where Torgar sets your opponent to 10 life. This would be in Modern, of course, and then you can Hitsusugu's Second Right your opponent for exactly 10 damage for 4 mana, right on curve if you have the turn 3 Torgar. So definitely a cool against the odds potential there. So I think Torgar is actually pretty good. The body is big, the fact that it comes down so cheaply makes it pretty exciting, and the ability to reset the life total can be really helpful in some matchups. We've seen like the tokens decks in Standard get to ridiculously high life totals, hundreds and hundreds of life, and Torgar doesn't really care how much life you gain. It's going to set you down to 10 life in Standard. It gives you some hate against life gain decks where it's not like, oh, you lose 10 life, you lose down to half of your starting life total, which is a pretty big deal when it comes to life gain matchups. So I think Torgar is going to be sweet. Again, you got to kind of build around it. You don't want to just play this with your good creatures and trust that it's going to be good enough. You want to have things that you can sacrifice fairly easily, because for 8 mana it's not a great deal, but if you have sackable creatures and can get this down by turn 4, it is a really powerful card. Next on our list, we have the white member of the 3-drop cycle, Bennish Marshall, and this card actually seems pretty reasonable. So triple white, obviously a hard to cast casting cost, but you get a 3/3, so a 3/3 for 3 is fine, and then it pumps your other creatures. It's essentially just a Lord for anything and always watching, whatever you want to consider it. So because this is a human knight, the first thing I thought of for Standard is some sort of knight tribal deck where you have like Dauntless Bodyguard on 1, you have Bennish Honor Guard on 2, you have History of Benalia also on 3, play a bunch of knights. Bennish Marshall is also a knight, so it's getting pumped by your History of Benalia, and then you just go to town, kill your opponent with all this damage. You can also just stack up the Bennish Marshalls. Remember, this is not a legend. Like a lot of the Dominaria creatures are legends, Bennish Marshall is not. So if you get 3 or 4 on the battlefield, they're all pumping each other, going really crazy. Also possible that you can just play this in a servo style deck or a token style deck, because remember, it's a Lord for anything. There's no restriction on what it's pumping, so you can do crazy things like Servo Exhibition on turn 2, maybe Bennish Marshall on turn 3 to pump your servos, turn 4 Strom's Expertise, another Bennish Marshall for the double pumpage, top it off with Angel of Invention. Seems like a really scary, aggressive curve as long as you don't get Wrath. So I'm excited for the potential of Bennish Marshall. Like all the cards in this cycle, you gotta be in a specific deck to be able to cast it. Monocolored or like primarily monocolored with a light splash, but you can't just play this in a normal 2-color deck. But it is a pretty big reward for being mono white or close to mono white, because pumping all your stuff with a good body, not being legendary, already a pretty good deal, potentially very powerful. We also got Mishra's Self-Replicator, and this card, it's really fun. I don't think this card is very good, but it's very fun. So 5 mana Grizzly Bear, 5 mana 2/2. However, whenever you cast a historic spell, you can pay 1. If you do, you create a token that's a copy of Mishra's Self-Replicator. So that means artifact, legends, sagas, any of that stuff. So the downside of Mishra's Self-Replicator is obviously it's a very small body for its cost. A 2/2 for 5 is not very good. However, it can spiral out of control pretty quickly because remember, all the copies are going to have this ability as well. So let's say you cast a random artifact, you make another copy, then you have 2 Mishra Self-Replicators. So the next artifact you cast, or legend, or saga, you get to pay 1 twice, so pay 2 mana, make 2 more, then you got 4 Self-Replicators. Then the next artifact you cast, you could pay 1 for each of those 4, and you're up to 8. Pretty soon you could just cast like a Mishra's Bobble and make a whole board full of Mishra Self-Replicators. Again, the fact that it's a 2/2 for 5, which means it dies to shock, it dies to just pretty much everything you can imagine, is definitely troubling. It's going to be hard to trigger it right away, and that's the other problem. If you could play this and trigger it right away, like a pack rat, I could see this getting really out of control really quickly. It's probably absurd in limited, like pack rat, but the fact that you got to spend 5 to cast it, you're probably not going to be able to cast an artifact and pay 1 on the same turn you cast it, gives your opponent this 1 turn window to kill it, and then you're just kind of time walking yourself. So I think it's a really fun card to build around. In the right situation, it can get incredibly out of control incredibly quickly over the course of like 2 or 3 turns. Suddenly you just have a wall of grizzly bears. But I think that the small body for its converted mana cost, plus being an artifact, probably means it won't really be tournament playable. We also got another equipment, Black Blade Reforge. So for 2 mana, you get a legendary equipment. It gives the equipped creature +1/+1 for each land you control. And then it costs roughly 1 trillion mana to equip. 7 to equip, unless you're equipping it to a legendary creature. Then it's equipping for just 3 mana. So kind of reminds me a little bit of like Volshuk Battle Gear. The play of it, at least right away, is kind of the same. You play it, you got 3 lands, you equip it, gonna give something +3/+3. That's a pretty good boost. Gotta mention, only even sort of playable if you're equipping it to legendary creatures, so you have to be like legendary tribal to even maybe consider Black Blade Reforge. And then as far as scaling, it reminds me a little bit of like Lash Wraith or Strata Scythe, except it doesn't have the restriction of a certain land type. Like Lash Wraith, you gotta be mono black. Strata Scythe, you gotta exile land, only hits 1 land type. So Black Blade Reforge is not the worst equipment we've seen recently, because we've had some pretty bad equipments, but it is pretty restrictive, so we'll have to wait and see. If an aggro deck with a ton of legendary creatures somehow emerges, I could see this possibly having a shot. Probably more likely post-rotation when it braids out of the format. So not a horrible equipment. It does scale pretty well to the late game, but it's in this weird spot where it wants you to have a lot of lands, which aggro decks don't typically want. You don't want to flood out and have 8 lands on the battlefield, but it also wants you to be aggressive, because putting this on your random 6-drop and making it even bigger, not all that appealing. You really want to be attacking and hitting with it like on turn 3. If you can go 1-drop legend, this on turn 2, equip this on turn 3, you're going to be hitting for like 5 or something. So it's in a weird place as far as how you actually build around it, but if the right deck emerges, it could have a shot. As far as our lower rarity cards, we have about 1 million of them. We're not going to talk about all of them in depth, but there's a handful that I wanted to mention. So Skirk Prospector is exciting because it's coming to Modern for the first time. It might not look like much. 1 mana 1/1 lets you sack a goblin to add a mana, but it allows for some really explosive plays, especially with Mog War Marshal. So Mog War Marshal kind of turns into a ritual because you get 3 bodies to sack when you cast it. So you can do things like Skirk Prospector on turn 1, Mog War Marshal on turn 2, sack it because of the Echo trigger, sack 1 of the tokens, follow that up with a Bushwhacker, hit your opponent for just tons of damage out of nowhere. So I feel like Skirk Prospector definitely has potential in Modern Goblins, especially the 8-whack build, where it will speed up that deck, maybe not a full turn, but by a pretty significant amount. So definitely excited to see what Skirk Prospector can do in Modern for the first time. We also have Quiden Pride of Femerif. Oh my god, I'm sure I did not say that close to correctly. Which is basically like Kinsbale Cavalier. I mean, it's not exactly Kinsbale Cavalier because it gives all your first striking creatures double strike, but on level 1, most knights have first strike, so it plays like a standard legal Kinsbale Cavalier in a lot of senses. You can also build like cool first strike tribal, which would be pretty fun in Commander. So a fun build around. We'll see if it could show up in Knight Tribal, if Knight Tribal is even often a thing. Maybe it has potential there, potentially as like a one of or something. So I don't know. It's a cool card, unique ability, fun to build around. Not sure how good it'll be though. We also got just a ton more commons and uncommons. Warcry Phoenix maybe could be okay. 2/2 flying haste for 4 doesn't sound great, although if you attack with your creatures, you can get it back from a graveyard for 3 mana. Still a little more expensive than some of the other Phoenixes we've seen. Maybe if there's a aggro Boros style deck with a bunch of attackers it could work, but feels a little bit too expensive. We also got Skittering Surveyor. Definitely have played Pilgrim's Eye in the past. This is basically ground version of Pilgrim's Eye. Could imagine it showing up if you really need to fix your mana in a budget deck, or just really care about getting basic lands. Untamed Kavu, not bad. 2/2 for 2 with Vigilance and Trample isn't bad, and then a 5/5 for 5 with Vigilance and Trample isn't bad. I don't know if there's any way this actually shows up in Standard. The tribal aspect isn't really there. Kavus I don't think will be a thing in Standard, but it's close enough that it's worth mentioning at least. And then Yours Familiar is a way to basically make all your planeswalkers cost 1 less to cast. It also hits sagas and artifacts. We all have other ways, better ways of making artifacts cheaper, even in Standard. So I think that this is more of a saga slash planeswalker support card. Seems fun to build around. Not sure if it'll really work in Standard, but cool like Super Friends Commander type card to just get a huge discount on all of your planeswalkers. Otherwise, just a ton of commons and uncommons. Most of them aren't really going to be playable. They're important for limited. Something like Academy Journey Mage, maybe for Wizards in Standard, but it's a little overcosted. Some artifacts, some Pegasuses, Pegasi, Aven Sentry, also some Sphinx and Elves, and Divination is back. Finally, Hellar the Firefletcher gives us another uncommon legend, kind of for kicker tribal, I guess. A 3/3 for 3 isn't bad. I don't know if it's good enough though. Llanowar Scout, putting a land onto the battlefield from your hand, and then on Sarah's Wings, might actually have a slight chance of showing up. 4 mana is a lot, but giving a creature +1/+1, flying, vigilance, and lifelink basically turns it into like a Baneslayer Angel, more or less. And we do have the blue-white Boggle deck with Sram to draw cards. Putting this on a Danto's Vanguard, pretty scary. That's a hard to deal with creature that's gaining tons of life, flying over for damage. So there might be an outside chance that that can actually show up as like a one of in the blue-white Boggles deck. And those have been our daily Dominaria spoilers for today. So let me know what you think. What do you think of the new equipment? How good is Jasufez? Is that card going to be very strong in Standard, or am I overrating it? Can the Antiquities War bring artifacts back to the forefront of Standard? How busted is Togar? How cheap can we make it, setting opponents' life totals down to 10? What about Bennish Marshall? Can that support a White Weenie or Knight or Servo style deck? How about Mishra Self-Replicator? What are the ways we can actually break that? Is there some combo I'm missing? Does Skirk Prospector show up in Modern Goblins? Does it make that deck better? All the other commons and uncommons, let me know about them as well. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I will talk to you soon. Thanks for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, help us out by clicking that like button down below. And to keep up on all the latest and greatest, click that subscribe button. And don't forget to hit that bell icon to get alerts whenever we have new videos. And if you want to, check out some of our other sweet videos here and here.